Hello, everyone. I can see that there are already some participants joining, and we should be live with this webinar from MEF Mobile Ecosystem Forum. Everybody, welcome, and I should say good evening, good afternoon, good morning. We seem to have a very international group, not just as speakers, but in the audience as well. Today, we're talking about stir shaking in North America, because that's probably where we've seen it starting and developing, but really how the lessons from stir shaking in North America are reaching now well outside the continent. And we do that to talk about robocalls, marketing nuisance calls, and so on, something that affects everybody, unfortunately, of us. I mean, I haven't met somebody that has been untouched by the plague yet. But we're talking about the lessons learned on how to fight them, and specifically stir shaking, which is one, as we'll see, of the most famous implementations, and that at one point was telling us that things were going to get better. Will they? Have they? Well, we'll ask to our three panelists. I'm very glad to welcome, in no particular order, but Eric Pritzkels, the Chief Executive of Risk and Assurance Group. Eric is very familiar to us at MEF. We have a pleasure working with RAG on multiple things. So thanks, Eric, for being here. Now, first time, and very welcome to two new faces. We like that. At MEF, the first one is Matthew Gamble, a technologist and innovator, and also the principal consultant at INT123 Consulting. I think I might have got that right this time, but you'll confirm and tell me. And also, if I'm not mistaken, also the vice chair for the Internet Society in the Chamber of Canada. So welcome, and thanks, Matt. And then we have George Cray from iConnected, the Senior Vice President of Information Solutions, Products and Services, and one of the persons behind actual, with big screws and so on, the actual solution as well. So we've got different sides of industry, the Risk and Assurance Group, an independent consultant, and also iConnected. I like that as a start itself. So thank you again for being here. Now, maybe it's worthwhile to take one step back and remind some of us, including myself, what is the problem that we are trying to solve? Eric, what is robocalls, and what has the industry tried to do so far about it?
That's a really good question. It's a question that a lot of people get wrong in terms of how they answer it as well. So thank you for letting me have that one. I'll try to get it right. Robocalls, using a machine to make a call. That seems self-explanatory. Often people use these machines to make calls that are unwanted by the person receiving them. One of the biggest areas of confusion is whether it's unwanted or illegal. And those two categories quite often get confused, and it's important to distinguish between them. And I'll give an illustration of the difference between unwanted and illegal. An unwanted call for a typical American would be the 10% of robocalls they receive during election year from politicians who are seeking their vote and seeking campaign donations. All perfectly legal if sent to your home fixed line number. Not legal if sent to your mobile phone without your permission. Now, of course, there are many examples of illegal robocalls, and when we talk about illegality, what actually we're talking about is quite often that we're more concerned with the way a phone is being used to facilitate a crime. And so, in fact, a lot of robocalls are just a segue, a mechanism to actually then sometimes put a real person on the line to the person who will then try to engage in some kind of scam. So even though we may start with a robocall, you may end up with two human beings talking to each other on the phone. The robocall is just used as a way to get somebody on the line in the beginning, just like any other call center might make a robocall. And all of these topics tend to get mushed together with the idea that you may deceive somebody by presenting a phone number, a CLI, as we would call it in the UK. Caller ID is more typically called in North America. You may present a caller ID which is not representative of where that call originated. And again, that might be considered illegal because there's some deception taking place, or the North American business culture means it's quite often is considered legal because although it's a call center, say in the Philippines, whatever, it represents a large corporate entity. And somewhere or other, it's felt necessary that that large corporate entity should present a number that's domestic to the USA. So in substance, a lot of big connected problems there that we're breaking out. But one way or another, however you look at it, the population of the USA and many other countries are getting very, very, very upset with the number of calls they're receiving, whether legal or illegal, and they want politicians to do something about it. And that's why we're talking today. That's the fundamental. People upset, politicians doing something about it, and then we can explore what the politicians doing, how has the industry responded to the politicians, whether the industry is doing the things the politicians actually want, and whether the politicians are doing the right things or not.
Interesting, Eric. And I would say that I know that's incidental, but I know some households that have decided not to have a fixed line anymore because the problem is I'm just using it to receive calls. I don't want it anymore. What a bad thing for the industry if we drive our users away from our own services. So if sometimes the operators themselves should be wanting a solution out there. But let's talk about solutions. And in that case, George, as you are esteemed vendor of one of the solutions, possibly many. What is available in the industry, the broader industry, to stop some of this problem?
Sure. Maybe just picking up where Eric left off. I think we all think about the nuisance calls we get on our phones, and obviously we struggle many times. We don't answer calls. If you think about the problem, there's two sides to the problem. Enterprises that are legitimate are struggling to actually reach people and have them answer legitimate calls, whether it's one that you were expecting to get, or maybe you have an issue with your credit card and it's a potential fraud alert. There's reasons why enterprises really want to leverage this communication channel. And I think, as Eric stated, there's a whole lot of reasons the public has just gotten, more or less frustrated because the communications channel is filled with so much either nuisance calls or unwanted calls. And so ultimately, the goal is to get back to trusting that you should answer a call. I think we don't want this communications channel to be filled like many people's email and other things. We want to be able to know when we should answer a call. And so what they did in the US, there was the adoption of this stir-shaken technology. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is the technology itself is more around adding a trust anchor. It's more about know your customer. And really the concept was an originating service provider should cryptographically sign and attest that say an enterprise who's making that phone call both has the right to the telephone number, and I know that it is that person or that company that is in fact making that call. And so therefore I can fully attest this phone call as it goes through the network. And it was really targeted at IP phones because with the age of VoIP and the ability to easily basically spoof IP calls and use different CLI, it became very important to understand how could we ensure that we knew that was a legitimate phone call as it went through the network, and be able to present that to a consumer as trusted. And that's how more or less Shaken was adopted in the US. And there was a sense that this would, be the answer to stopping nuisance calls or illegal robocalls. But I think we found that it hasn't eliminated robocalling. It hasn't eliminated nuisance calling. It has created a lot of confusion as to, how to implement it and how to make it more effective. And so I think we have more to explore here about how this was implemented in the US and other places like Canada.
Well, if you're talking about Canada, I think we should ask Matthew as well. What's his experience in Canada? We just learned all these certification, apologies for the bad simplification I'm doing, but a certification system applied to try and avoid the problem that in internet everybody can be a dog or anybody as they want. Now here it is trying to apply it in telecom backwards, and the solution, again, Matt, you can tell me, was also picked up in Canada after the US, correct?
Correct. The Canadian regulator sort of sold it to everyone here as the magic bullet to solve all of the robocalling problems.
And by the way, I should ask everybody, was it the magic bullet that solved those problems?
I think it's important to reiterate what was just said, that, you know, Shake and Stir is a trust anchor. It's not anything to do with robocalling. It's not about spam blocking. It's there to provide, I can trust the number presented is the number calling, and that's all it does.
I think,
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to jump in. I'm going to have to jump in because I understand why that's said from the technology level, and I respect the technologists, but it has that those words have a meaning when used in front of the general public, and it's no good as saying that we've overpromised. It's been overpromised, and then we use words like authentication and trust anchor without understanding what this sounds like to the public. Stir Shaken, I would say, is not a trust anchor. And the reason I would say it is having a mechanism to apply a signature to a call tells you nothing about whether the signature should have been applied to the call. Stir Shaken is a technology surrounded by a series of protocols that's meant to ensure only the good calls get a signature. But you have to put in place the supporting infrastructure to ensure only good actors are allowed to sign good calls. And what we've already seen in the USA, apologies, I don't have the data of Canada, Matthew, but what we've already seen in the USA is that plenty of bad calls are getting their signatures applied. And I would say that this is indicative of a failure to implement sufficiently rigorous know your customer controls. So if you can say there aren't sufficiently rigorous know your customer controls, then that means your trust anchor is not a trust anchor anymore. You've already destroyed the trust in the process that's meant to retain the trust.
And I think if I jump in there, Dario, what we see in the US, there's probably over 600 service providers who have adopted Shaken and have come on to Stir Shaken in the US. What we're definitely seeing, though, is it's the early innings or the early days of trying to understand how to apply Stir Shaken. And the FCC had done things as well to change behavior of service providers, where in the past, a service provider's goal was to deliver every phone call. If you had a call going across the network, the expectation was it would be delivered to that end consumer. Really, things have shifted now with the implementation of Stir Shaken and the expectation that service providers need to do more to protect consumers from especially illegal or spoofed calls, where they really need to protect them from any kind of fraudulent activity. And therefore, there should be more blocking done of calls that they know shouldn't be trusted. And so I think the whole behavior and how service providers adopt their robocall mitigation strategies, which again goes beyond just the implementation of a technology, as Eric and Matt pointed out, is really where we're starting to learn and really where we have to grow, because it is not a silver bullet. I mean, that definitely is probably a mischaracterization. Anyone thinking that the implementation of Stir Shaken would, quote unquote, be the answer to, eliminating nuisance robocalling.
Magic bullets, we found very few in life, it seems, specifically in all the issues with risk, revenue assurance, and fraud specifically. Well, but let me ask again to Matt. So generally, would you say that the life of a robocall is a bit harder, or that things are still open as an open field?
It's an excellent question you've asked there. And I'd say that, again, it's not shake and stir that's making the robocaller's life harder, but I think it is getting harder in general. But that's more with advances in machine learning, heuristics on call patterns and things like that, that are making, you see the indication in your phone of spam likely and things like that. Shake and stir is one input to that machine learning algorithm, but we already had decent algorithms before shake and stir. They're already doing a good job. So the technological arms race itself is making the life harder, not necessarily shake and stir.
Ooh, technology arms race. I like that. Sorry, George, you were saying something?
Yeah, I was going to say one of the advantages to cryptographically signing calls, also it enables traceback. And so another mechanism that has been going on in the US was trying to leverage traceback of where you find, the fraudsters are always evolving. And I'm sure Eric can kind of talk to this aspect. Whatever hurdles we tend as an industry to put in front of a good fraudster, they figure out how to get over those hurdles. They figure out how to jump higher or get around them altogether. And so it's always a game of where trying to almost play whack-a-mole of where do you eliminate and shut down. And I think when Shaken got implemented in the US, we have seen a number of the bad actors kind of shift offshore. And so there's a situation where now it isn't just within the US jurisdiction to clean up what's going on inside its borders, but you have obviously international calling and all sorts of originations coming into the US, which make that even, again, harder to stop. And there is no way to mandate stir shaken or the ability to actually sign that call from the origination point. There's only rules around gateway providers and how it enters the US. And generally those calls come in as a C attestation, which really doesn't have much of a trust factor. It's the lowest level. It means I don't know the caller and I don't know their right to use the TN, and therefore it is untrusted within the stir shaken, attestation scheme.
I think the one important thing to note, though, is we move towards more shake and stir. When we get to the do not originate stuff, that gets rid of some of the scam calls that are really trying to defraud people, saying I'm calling from the IRS, I'm calling from the local police. At least do not originate on a international trunk. At least starts to solve some of that stuff. It's not going to deal with robocalling per se, but it might deal with some of the more criminal aspects of it.
And I jump in, if I understand correctly, do not originate is a list of numbers you should not accept in your network. Correct, as they're probably associated with right.
The IRS only originates from here. So if somebody else tries to use IRS phone number, just don't allow it.
That I'll avoid. Now, Eric, I'd like to ask you as well, because you've been strangely quiet, and I'm almost.
I was trying to jump in there. But I let Matthew speak instead, because Matthew deserves to have his fair share of time. I'm champing at the bit to say also. So what are you going to ask me, Dario?
Well, I'm going to ask you because I'm gathering in, and there's been some discussions that this idea of tools versus implementations versus strategy, if you want. That seems to be so. We have realization that stir shaking might not be the magic bullet that some have heard or talked about, but is actually a tool in the armory of. And as such, we still need to evolve the solution, understand how it works. Is that goes in line with what you're thinking, or is it?
I think to be fair to George, everything he said is correct, and we've heard this been said many times. I can vouch because I checked. Stir shaking is not a silver bullet. It's a phrase that you can find people using in 2018. So they've been consistently saying stir shaking is not a silver bullet. But all the conversation starts in the wrong place. Stir shaken's a tool, and the assumption is we're going to use this tool, and then we're going to work out what the strategy is afterwards. And George has correctly pointed out 2 distinct strategies. And I appreciate you, George, pointing them out, because they quite often get blurred in people's mind and they're confused. One strategy involves improving the quality of the algorithms used for automated blocking. That's a strategy. There's another strategy, which is trace the origin of bad calls, then do something about it. And I would say that although we keep saying it's a tool in the armor and it's not everything, it's not the silver bullet, what we're doing is we're watching the USA fail to execute either strategy correctly, because nobody's identifying all the things that are not being done per either strategy. How is the strategy for automated blocking not working? Well, as George has pointed out, if you have a C-level attestation from an operator that basically says, hey, we've got a call here, we're not really sure where it comes from, but hey, we're going to pass it on now with the signature. It's not really any use for working out whether you should block that call or not. And businesses like Verizon have already pointed out to the FCC, you can slap a lot of C-grade signatures on calls. It won't really help them do any better blocking than they would have done before. So if your strategy is to improve blocking, you can't do it in some kind of national way when you know a lot of your traffic is going to come from other countries and unsigned calls. You also can't do it if you know a lot of calls are not being passed over IP networks from origin to source, because stir shaking is an IP technology. It relies upon SIP headers. So although some work has been done to address that, we know that even the majority of calls in the USA, you can't apply the signature to from the origin to the source, which is why I say that there's a lot of unsigned calls that are nuisance robocalls, bad robocalls, even within the USA, even though stir shaking is mandatory for large telcos in the USA. That's the strategy for blocking. Because the strategy for blocking has seemed to be less promising because of the problems that I've just outlined with international calls and George would recognize in terms of C-grade attestation, more emphasis is now being put on tracing the origin of a call. Fine. Okay. Let's assume that we're going to focus more on tracing as the strategy for dealing with this problem. Then the question that has to be dealt with, and not by technologists, the question that has to be dealt with is, what are you going to do after you've traced the call? Somebody needs to have some repercussions for allowing bad traffic to be passed over their network or for being the person who originated that bad traffic. And the problem that the US has with its strategy is that its strategy is not convincing for regulators, governments, telcos around the world. It's not convincing because the USA has a consistent track record of doing absolutely nothing to punish the root cause of bad traffic. They find the people, they identify the people, prosecutors will reach a settlement with those people. There will be no prison time. There will be a large nominal fine that the FTC and the FCC, they both like reducing press releases saying what large nominal fines have been levied. And nobody goes back and mentions they never collected those fines, never collected those fines. And then the person who reached a settlement will go away, create a new front organization and start the whole process again. And telcos are in the middle of that. And so I would say the major problem that the US has is that you can clamp down on those telcos that are in the middle. You can put more burden on them. You can put more pressure on them and threaten them with fines. But if I was a telco in some other faraway country, maybe the country where a lot of this traffic is originating, my legal counsel is going to be saying, let's do the least we possibly can to help the US with its strategy. And the reason for doing that is that there is no upside for them helping. There's only a downside for them helping. There's the downside that if they help, some unhelpful prosecutor in the USA will go back and try to punish them for any seeming negligence that they have ever committed. Whereas if they provide the least information, the least help, the least support possible to the USA, they minimize their risk of ever being prosecuted. And they know very well that nobody's taking the root cause of the problem and putting them in prison or stopping them from doing what they're doing, and therefore taking the problem off their back. And that is a fundamental flaw with the US strategy, which is not to do with the technology of stir shaken, but needs to be addressed before we talk about stir shaken being a tool in our armory.
And then also, Eric, just to add on, you also have the perverse incentives of the receiving US carriers where they want to receive the minutes, they want to process them, they want to get the revenue, even though these are junk calls, right? They're making money off of them. So they have perverse incentives not to stop it in the first place.
George,
or even, excuse me, or even to encourage the traffic to be masked, to be disguised, to have a C or B grade attestation, knowing that poor know your customer control has been put in place. And this is a fundamental problem too.
Right. Yeah. So let me jump in. And obviously, a lot of what Eric points out is really the challenge for all of us, because that situation in the US that Eric just described is not peculiar to the US. In fact, there are plenty of countries. I talked to other regulators, and they're struggling with the same kind of challenges of, hey, they can do a better job of dealing with their own service providers that are domestic and about knowing your customer, but they still have, international calls coming in. They have the same kind of nuisance call problem. So it's not unique to the US. I think the US, as Eric said, maybe moved first and therefore implemented a technology and maybe implemented some regulation, but it has not stopped, or it has not eliminated the true problem, which is the nuisance robocalling or nuisance calling. It is going to take everyone, the whole ecosystem, to figure out how can we work together to really put an end to this. Because I want to go back to something I started with, which is there is legitimate enterprises, legitimate businesses that want to reach consumers over the phone. And they're spending more money to call and to reach you, and in many cases take many times to reach you because you're not answering that phone, because so many calls go directly to voicemail. I know I've read statistics that say, 75 to 90% of the calls go right to voicemail, and people won't answer their phone. And I'm sure you've all read these kinds of things. You probably, as a consumer, know your own behavior, unless the person's in your contacts and you know who's calling you. Sure, I answer the call when my daughter calls me, but these random 800 numbers or a number that I'm not familiar with, I'm going to let it go to voicemail. And on occasion, those are legitimate calls I should have answered, that I may have wanted to answer, but I just didn't recognize. And so I don't think the problem is peculiar to the US. I think we as an industry have to figure out how we can work together. And it really is around regulators and large service providers who are global, to understand what a mechanism would be that could allow more legitimate calls to be recognized, hopefully signed and delivered as trusted, so that you can do a better job of getting to the calls you want to answer. I don't know how you ever totally eliminate all the nuisance calls, because as Eric started, there's a bunch of them that are probably legal that we still don't want. And I'm not sure you're going to stop those, but we definitely have to do a better job of presenting calls to consumers that give you some level of trust as to whether you believe the person calling is who they say they are.
Let me play devil's advocate in this case. There are some of the challenges, but if you are a regulator, if you are in Europe right now, well, we have seen that France is picking up stir shaken. We've seen that ours is. Why then is this stir shaken still the only easy answer, or is it the beginning of an answer, or what is available to a regulator out there?
And I can start, and I'm sure Eric will have Eric or Matt may have some comments, but I think as a tool, not as a silver bullet, but as a tool, it is an element to potentially enforce a know your customer and not simply rely on the analytics at the end where you terminate the call. So it's an element to enforce service providers to cryptographically sign a call. The shortcoming, which we've already hit multiple times, you can't just regulate that within a certain set of borders. This is a global communications infrastructure that we need to come up with a mechanism that can work beyond the borders. And stir shaking itself as a technology is not the answer to stopping nuisance calls. So I think it's a mechanism or a tool that can be added, but it has to be a broader approach if we're really going to make a dent in the problem.
Thanks. Eric, why has France picked up the stir shaking, do you think?
Well, I think I know exactly why France picked up stir shaking. And again, I want to step back one step from stir shaking and technology to how do politicians work. Politicians have a terrible track record of making promises on things like intellectual property in the internet era, passing laws that they can't actually enforce. Politicians have a terrible track record of passing laws about privacy and data protection in the internet era that they can't enforce. And now politicians are going to have a terrible track record of passing laws about preventing nuisance calls that they can't enforce. The law in France is quite different to the law that was implemented in the USA because it didn't prescribe the use of stir shaken. The law in France is very straightforward. It says you may not pass on a call that hasn't been authenticated to the recipient. And this is a law that every French telco is going to break by the deadline in 2023 because they don't have a technology to do that, except in those cases where stir shaken works, because you need a SIP call to do it. And there are still TDM calls in the world. So they don't have an answer for how they're going to comply with the law, as simply stated as it is in France, for a lot of phone calls. But they're going to do what they can do where they can do it. And the politicians will fudge the issue, and the telcos will do the best they can. And we're all going to meander along. And so there will be a law on the French statute that is not meaningfully enforced because nobody knows how to enforce it. Now, this contrasts with the US law. So the credit to US legislators, when they passed the equivalent law in the USA, the law was phrased more intelligently than the French law. The US law said to telcos in the USA, you must, if you're running an IP network, implement stir shaken. And if you're not running an IP network, you have a choice. Your choice is 1, get an IP network instead of that non-IP network, or 2, do something. I simplify a bit, but that's basically what the law says. So you can see the US legislators did have the same problem as the French legislators. They didn't know what to prescribe for a lot of phone calls, but at least they had enough sense to focus on what they could prescribe, okay? Whereas the French have prescribed some wonder solution that doesn't exist for all phone calls, which is why one has to step back and say, let's look at other countries too, like Germany. And I understand the situation in Germany is that they are going to focus on taking an approach more like the one that Matt was mentioning earlier on in our call, which is focus on international inbound calls and whether a domestic CLI is being attached to those international inbound calls. And then as a process of examination, say to yourself, well, we know that these calls can't possibly be validly, the origin can't, this number CLI can't possibly represent the valid origin. We'll either block or in some way handle those calls differently so they don't get to end users. And this is a valid strategy. It's been very successful indeed in Australia in reducing the number of scam calls reduced by Australians. But it is a distinct approach to the approach which, as I say, focuses on using stir shaken, a technology. This is a different approach. And I think the Americans are in great danger of underutilizing this tool, partly because of business culture, partly because so many big American businesses run big offshore contact centers, and they want those US phone numbers associated, which is why I mentioned that at the outset. And that's important because that problem is not the same scale of problem in many other countries. So although George is completely correct, these things are completely global. And to some extent, the problems in the USA should have been perfectly easy to anticipate. One subset of robocalls is Wangiri calls, made by machines, very large numbers of calls, obviously a nuisance in the sense that people don't want them and they're designed to trick people into calling back. And yet we know from all the data that this is clearly a global phenomenon. We can look at the traffic. The RAG maintains a database of exactly what's happening in terms of calls flow from one country. So we know that this is an international problem. You have to have a strategy that's designed to tackle primarily the international problem, not the national problem, but no national regulator, no national government is set up to do it. And that's why we face the conundrum we have today.
I would like to ask Matt similar situations. What would you do if you were a regulator, pretty much? But before that, it's not time for. We don't have commercial breaks here. It's all for you. But it's a reminder that I have seen the questions out there, and do write your questions. I'm treasuring them for later on. So to keep on all that involves. Well, Matt, I gave you 10 more seconds to prepare your answer. You are now the best position to tell us. What would you do if you were a regulator? Make a choice right now.
I think the challenge now is that now that Shake and Stir has started to be adopted by the industry, and by I mean that the vendor side of things, in the soft switches, SBCs, things like that, it now has a snowball momentum that will keep moving it forward. If you're France, for example, you can't come up with a made in France, no offense to France, but you can't come up with a made in France solution because nobody's going to support the technology behind it. You're not going to convince the Lucents, the Ericssons, the Meta switches of the world to go and write a new library just to support French caller ID authentication. We had this problem in Canada historically. We had our own caller ID specification, the Centaur spec. And for years, vendor equipment never did it right because, well, it's the Canadian market who's going to write their switch to support Canada. So if you don't pick the juggernaut, the 800-pound gorilla of Shake and Stir, you're now going to fight two uphill battles of A, trying to get the technology implemented, and B, getting someone to support whatever spec you came up with.
There we go. Now, let me turn that not just to regulator, but now let me ask you, what would you do if you were today managing the entire industry? What would be the solution to the robocalls, marketing nuisance? Find your own definitions of these problems.
I don't know if there's a solution, but I will say if I'm France, I will take one lesson from Canada that we haven't talked about here. And that is the mistake Canada made with its Shake and Stir rollout. And I'll sort of change your question around. The Canadian regulator didn't work with the smaller IP players. And those are the people who were probably in the best position to implement Shake and Stir. They focused on saying, hey, Big Lec, you need to do this. But Big Lec is all TDM. We actually kept the smaller players out of the ability to get certificates, to participate, and all that stuff. If I'm a regulator looking to implement something like Shake and Stir, I want to start with the smaller providers first and make sure they get in, because they're the ones who are running IP-only networks, who are in the position to implement the technology, and are actually the people that can make the changes needed faster than a big, existing LEC with a ton of copper behind them.
George, what would you change in the industry today to make it all better?
Well, I think the way I'm going to take your question, Dario, is I'm not sure I can change what's already been implemented, but I'm going to talk about what we need to continue to do, because I think the game is, how do you take advantage of what's there and how do we improve upon it? Because as Eric said, it hasn't solved the nuisance calls, but what we really need to do is push beyond the borders. And so if you have enterprises and businesses that are legitimately trying to work from a call center in another country and send traffic into the US, we need those to have a mechanism to be signed at the origin, and a way to have them trusted. Because I think of the enterprise side of this, the business side of this, there's a goal to figure out how to take advantage of what Stir Shaken is and the laws that have been implemented inside the US, and figure out is there a way that they can get their calls answered? Because I think this is not about whether or not we get robocalls. It's about whether or not consumers will actually pick up the phone again. I think we have to figure out a way to bring telecommunications back in vogue where someone's willing to, answer a call. And so I want to go towards extending beyond our borders, find ways to have shaken extended, and then come up with the right mechanisms to block what's not trusted, which I think we're not doing a great job of right now. And so there's probably a number of things to do. Eric pointed out the blocking calls that are starting outside your shore when you know that number should not be initiated outside. That is something that many regulators are looking at, and I think that's a very smart thing to do. I've had discussions in India where they were thinking the same thing, where they shouldn't have local numbers when they know the number, and the person resides in the country and is not traveling. Why are they letting those calls actually come in across border? They can do a lot better at blocking. And so I do think there's a number of mechanisms that can be added to some rules that we've already put in place to make it better. And I'm starting to work with businesses relative to how do they really want to get their calls answered. And so we're doing things around branded calling to help brands actually be able to deliver their logo and their calling name and their call reason as part of the certificate. So this is rich call data that could be utilized within the cryptographic signature and sent along the path. Now, that also opens us up to, wouldn't that be a great thing to spoof? So from the standpoint of how do you get to trusted calling, I think consumers are asking for, let me know when I should trust that this call is legitimate. Let me know why I should answer that call. It's like when you open your front door, you look through the peephole or you look at your Ring camera or your doorbell camera. And if you're expecting a delivery from FedEx and the person is wearing a FedEx uniform and has the box, you're probably apt to open the door. And we're trying to get to that same spot, with telecommunications. Can there be enough information presented that I should trust to actually answer the call?
Eric, I have a question. I think a question it was for you, and it was some time ago, because you've been talking about some of the numbers, and anonymous attendees said, has there been a shift of robocalls activity from in US to out US? I thought that was what you were saying. So the outbound international calls coming in. Is that correct?
I don't have any data on that. I know that the number of calls that they've got received in the US has gone up. I think that's a really good question. And because we've heard a lot of people in senior positions in the US industry say that there's been more calls from outside of the USA, they've never shown any data to substantiate that. And I think we should look at that. And I think we should look at that very seriously, because it's not good enough to just say, well, we've done the best job that we can in the USA. If it's gone up, it must be foreign calls. Where's the data? I mean, maybe there is data to substantiate it. So I don't have the data and I can't answer that question, but I think it is a question that needs to be examined and looked at very closely, because the danger is excuses are being made for failures within the USA. As I point out, known criminals, known American criminals, recidivists who have a modus operandi, established modus operandi of creating illegal robocalls in the USA, they're not being prosecuted. They are not being punished. They are not being deterred. So although I respect and understand the arguments that the problem may be originating outside the USA, I would say get your own house in order first before you expect other countries to spend a lot of money on technology assisting the USA with the problem. You've got to be shown that you're doing everything you can to deal with the locally sourced problem. And I don't think the USA has done that.
And can I ask, Matt, in any case, would you have some numbers or some feelings for the Canadian market as well?
Well, no, I was actually going to say one of the challenges in Canada is our regulator is requiring carriers to report on implementation status, number of signed calls, all of this stuff on a regular basis. yet none of the data has been made public yet. So like Eric said, we're sort of sitting in the same boat where we think it may be doing something, but we have no idea if it actually is doing anything.
Okay, so definitely there is more numbers to need to more understanding to be done. I'd love to have another webinar at this point about the evolution of all of this. Where are we going? But I've got questions first to ask about what we've been discussing so far. Scott Taylor, thanks for your question. You said really interesting the international initiated calls. Well done to the panels. Why can't the policy adopt similar concept of a center ID, blacklist, whitelist? Large corporation with overseas call centers register on a whitelist, for instance. So to address some of the discussion we're talking about offshoring call center, you can still defend them by saying, yes, they're mine. Anybody would like to answer that question?
I'll have a go if you want, and I'll say something suitably controversial, but at the same time, it's not controversial because everybody knows the way the world is. I'll just be the one who says it. If you run a anti-fraud association in the telecoms industry, whether national or international, you will get a bunch of people who will say, let's not let that telco join our meeting because that telco over there, that's the one that causes all the bad stuff we don't like. And the problem is this: if you're a politician, and so let's cut the politician some slack. If you're a politician and you're sat above it, you can't filter through those messages to work out when people are pointing fingers elsewhere, saying, he's the one, it's not me, it's over there, don't blame me. And you look at the standard of evidence needed in a court of law to prove somebody's a bad actor. Well, there's a big difference between the gut feel, the analytics of data, however you want to look at it, that's below the level you'd need to prove something in a court of law, that leads telcos to go, I know who's really out there, who's doing the bad stuff. We don't want to deal with them and them and them. There's a big gap between that and the level where you can say to a lawyer, to a politician, to somebody in government, it's definitively those people, let's do something about it. So we need to have a way to close that gap. And we've dealt with this problem in the domains in the technology era. And an example would be if somebody abuses your copyright online, we don't expect to go through like a long-winded legal process to prove your copyright was abused online. We expect people like YouTube to have like a simple referral process. And so we put trust in businesses to police other businesses. You know, the reason, you know, the US approach to dealing with spam, voice spam, has been very much based upon the approach that's been taken in the past with email spam, the use of signatures, the use of certificates, the use of a PKI infrastructure. Email spam, the number one factor which leads us to have less email spam is that Google handles 1/4 of all email in the entire world. So do you want to hand power over to big businesses to do policing, or do you want to maintain this illusion that you're going to have some kind of government level playing field and it'll all get sorted out between us? Because as much as it's been not an entire success, George alluded to the fact that we don't want spam in our intros. Our telecoms, our international global telecoms industry is far more fragmented than the market for email. So the idea that we can just police ourselves, well, pick out the good people, we'll soon find those 1 or 2 bad people, is a nonsense. We need help as an industry from politicians, but we also need to be more prepared to stand up and point fingers at bad actors within our ranks.
I'd also say,
oh, that's Matt. Then we'll go Matt first, and then George. Sorry, apologies.
I just wanted to add, it's a people and process problem as well, right? If you're building this national allow disallow list, you've got to come up with a process for people to register numbers, for it to be centrally put with some body that governs it, that then gets distributed to all the telcos. All the telcos have to agree on the file formats, and they have no economic incentive to do any of this because they're making money off the calls they're terminating already. Now you're asking them to do filtering, and what's the appeals process, and how do we do it? It's a process and person nightmare.
Yeah, and actually you picked right up on it, Matt, where I was going when Eric said the fragmentation and kind of the state of the ecosystem. To get the whitelist, blacklist, to be dealt with internationally across all of these operators. Just the alignment aspect is mind-boggling of how you can kind of get that to take place. And so there's the US put a robocall mitigation database, in place, but it's very coarse. It talks about, if you're Verizon or AT&T or T-Mobile, whoever it may be, you have your partner companies listed in there that you accept traffic from. It's not down at the, phone number level. It's really, will I accept, traffic from this company? And it's a very coarse tool. And obviously, some percentage, even in a trusted service provider relationship, some percentage of that traffic is probably unwanted and or fraudulent. So I don't know, with the tools in place today, it's just a bridge too far.
Well, by the way, I want to jump in and say some positive news for, Eric mentioned it was bad trade associations. There's some of them, like MEF, do manage to go through all the nightmares in a different situations. I'm just saying here nationally at SMS wide. But in that case, we did make sense of it. So I'm just trying to say it could be done. I'm not saying that we will be doing it. But I'm just.
Can I make one quick observation?
Sure.
We have 4 white men on this call. Okay. And
well, I try to darken my code by bad lightning, but no, yes, definitely. It's
there's a serious point. There's a serious point. When you talk about blacklisting calls and implementing blacklists on a global level, it's going to be very clear which countries are more likely to end up being blacklisted. We know that. Let's not be shy about saying that out loud. Now, the politicians, again, will sit up there and say, we should do something, we should do something, we should do something. But then if there is then over blocking of calls, we know who's going to suffer. It's going to be black people, brown people in poor countries and who are not well represented in our associations, not well represented in the groups that get to have these conversations, who are on the outside, who will be the recipients who don't get influence. And we need to be careful about this.
Good point. But one thing that I inadvertently mentioned, which is a question which really started, came at the very beginning. I just mentioned messaging. I was a completely different pair of hands. Ellie Katz from XConnect, say hello, has got 2 questions for you guys. The first one is exactly stir shaking designed for authenticating an attestation of voice, SIP calling. How can this apply to, well, actually saying to the MEF word, where many words are MEF, but we represent very much the A2P word as well. So the A2P, the business messaging, and ensure that sender ID, CLI, long codes, script codes, etc., are authenticated. It's obviously questions outside the technology, but the challenge. How do you take it? Is that some lessons learned, some potential that we can roll out? No magic bullet here, but something that would work across calls and messaging and avoid all of the fraud. Oh, I hear a very resounding silence.
Well, I didn't know if Matt would jump on that one, being the technologist, but I definitely would comment. Shaken as it's designed, wouldn't directly apply to the messaging world. I think we have some of the same challenges. I'll speak to the US and my own inbox on my phone that, I do get, we'll call it 10 DLC. These are telephone numbers that are messaging me. And in certain cases, I know they're fraudulent or, probably not legitimate in that it's unwanted by me and I wouldn't trust them. And there's obviously all kinds of phishing campaigns and vishing campaigns and, all types of things where people are trying to dupe you in order to steal from you. And the SMS world is definitely not immune to it. And again, it's going to get back to how do you trust or provide some mechanisms to understand the source of that message. And there is also a fragmented ecosystem in the messaging world on where messages get passed to aggregators, et cetera, and ultimately to a service provider to deliver to that handset. And so you have some of the same challenges of how do you ensure trust that that message is legitimate. But I don't think Shaken is the quote unquote technology that could apply. But the idea that you would want a trusted communication mechanism in SMS is clearly a desire.
Yeah, I was gonna say, unless we took SMS and flipped it to like SIP simple or something and said, hey, we're gonna make this IP too, there's no real way that Shaken's gonna get in there.
Right.
Hey, if you want to do it with SIP simple, we could throw Shaken in there. There's an RFC someone should go write.
Okay. Well, and I think this is actually, I think Ellie had there's been a desire, there's a discussions at MEF on how to converge on similar solutions in terms of solution, novel technologies, they're shaking, SIP, calling voice, different parents. But we will leave the questions open is how can you manage it? And do we have multiple solutions? But before there's another question from Ellie, before I ask, which probably is a nice way to round it off, but we also had, and I'm glad to say that we had at least a very known and important voice in the area of fraud managers, Katia Gonzalez, and also it's 4 white male that are talking, at least one woman voice. Finally, we're a bit of variety as well. Fantastic. Are we not missing, Katia says, the point of in focusing too much on signature and technology while some simple processes can bring material benefits? And they're already doing so. The example that Katia gives, international carrier filtering out wholesale traffic based on KYC intel, focusing on international CLI signature. So sorry if the last bit, I might have lost some bits, but I think you know what Katia says. Anybody would like to answer to Katia from BIX and what she's saying?
Or something if you want.
Eric, go ahead.
We've talked a lot about using a public key infrastructure, which is what STIR/SHAKEN is. It's an instance of a public key infrastructure where you apply a digital signature to a call. And of course, this is generalized and it can exist elsewhere, which is why if there was a way to attach the data to an SMS message, you could use the same approach to an SMS message. If you don't have a way to attach the data, you can't. Nevertheless, you have to pass some data from one party to the next party to the next party to the next party for that signature to get it where it's meant to be. We haven't spent any time today talking about the fact that if you're only interested in ensuring at the receiving end of a call that the call really was originated at the apparent origination of the call, you don't need to involve any of the carriers like BIX in the meantime. You don't need to do that. That wasn't given as a choice in the USA because the way the USA wrote the rule. That was a kind of choice in France, but they chose to use the STIR/SHAKEN technology. But you could just say, why don't the two telcos at each endpoint speak to each other about the call? Why don't they undergo some authentication process in parallel, out of band, at the same time as the call is being set up? That's a possibility. And I don't see why we should just dispense with that possibility entirely. In fact, if I was going to say, what could the USA do differently to quickly get results to please American voters? I'd be saying, Joe Biden, speak to Narendra Modi over in India, speak to Bongbong Marcos over in the Philippines. These countries, they're going to have offshored call centers. Speak to them and say, why don't you get the big telcos in the Philippines and in India to agree a protocol where they're directly communicating with the big telcos that are terminating calls in the USA, and you will get a big percentage gain very quickly without needing all the intermediaries to be passing signatures through it. So that's my offer to Katia. We should keep that on the table, and Katia would love that because it means she doesn't have to pass signatures over her network.
Well, I hope, let's see if anybody else has got an answer for Katia before we move to the last question for today. No,
I think Katia is right. I mean, it's more than just the technology. And I think that's been part of the purpose of this discussion today, is to bring out that it's not just about STIR/SHAKEN, and it's not that Stir Shaken is an answer to eliminating or greatly reducing, nuisance robocalling. I think we kind of all are. That is the one agreement we have on this panel.
Well, thanks. It is true, and it is time to probably come up with the final words for each one of you. We did say in our preparations these could go much longer than the hour, but we did reach out the hour. But it's a nice time. But by the way, and I see that Katya is probably Katya is saying the question was clear anyway. But thanks. And there we go. One question is what's happened now? What are your final words for wisdom? Is there plenty we had? You have less than a minute each, and I will start with Matt, which you haven't heard right now. Is there whatever last conclusion for what we learned today, Matt?
I think we've learned that Shake and Stir has a lot of applications. It's not the silver bullet, obviously. It serves a very specific purpose of adding trust and authentication, but it has absolutely nothing to do with stopping robocalls.
Thank you, Matt. And that was nice and simple, up to the point. We're taking notes. Eric, what would you add to what we just heard?
I think what Matthew just said is perfectly right. I think we need to understand if a strategy is being built around Stir Shaken, what the strategy is, and what would motivate other people who need to complement that strategy to choose to complement that strategy. It's a possible tool. It is a tool. Be aware of the other tools that could be implemented as well, and retain an open mind about which tools best complement the strategy you really want to affect in practice.
Thank you, Eric. And then George, you go the last sentence for the day.
Very good. Thank you. And I think, following with that logic, I want to broaden the discussion and think about how do we make telecommunications more usable. And so, yes, there's the aspects that Eric and Matt talked about as far as what else can we do to eliminate nuisance robocalling and mitigate that. And then there's the other side of the equation of what can we do to actually put trust back into the legitimate calls that will allow consumers really to answer, because that's what we need to get to. That's what the communication companies that are delivering these calls want to see happen, which is, it's a valuable communication tool, this telephone and these mobile phones, that you actually talk on them as opposed to just using your apps and just the messages. And so hopefully legitimate businesses with legitimate calls can actually use this tool the way it was intended.
Well, thank you. That takes us exactly to the hour, so I think I might have to close it down. But I feel like there was the appetizer for a much wider discussions and a much wider implication we have seen. If you just join us late, remember that you receive an email. We're going to play it back so you can actually go back and take notes of all the different bits. But right now, I only have time to say a big thank you to my three fantastic speakers, and thank you for having a very lively debate. Fantastic. We've seen the level of questions and participation that really worked. Thanks for George Gray from iConnective, for Eric Priskels from RRG, and from Matthew Gamble from INT 123 Consult. Thank you, all of you as well, for being watching us. And do tell us what you thought about it. Send us a question, send us comments as always. We'll come back with more soon on Stir Shaken. But for now, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.